agenda and introduce you to my two team mates that are here to present the rest of the material. So the agenda will begin, of course, with the welcome. That's what we're doing now. We have a walkthrough of our partnership with the city and Cap Metro at ATP to date. In other words, where we've come from on this journey. We'll be also talking about the Project Connect program and giving everybody an update. We recognize that every time we have a meeting, we may have people who've not heard a lot about Project Connect or don't have a level of understanding yet that some of the other folks do. So we want to make sure and provide that program update. And then we'll talk about the next meeting, the next tri-party meeting of the City Council, Cap Metro Board, and the Austin Transit Partnership Board on October 29th, at which the three bodies will take action on this joint powers agreement. So what we're here today for is to show you what that agreement is all about, the components, and to take your questions and feedback. So what I'd like to do now is pass it on to Sam Sargent, who is Director of Strategy at the Austin Transit Partnership, and he will walk us through the materials regarding the partnership to date, as well as the Project Connect program update, and then hand it off to Leanne Miller, who is with the City of Austin's Project Connect office and one of our partners. Take it away, Sam.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jackie. And thank you to everybody who's joining us this evening. We couldn't do any of this without you. And I think it's important to note that whether it's the Joint Powers Agreement, which is a very important document, but there are going to be so many other important elements of this program, from evenings like this, talking about what is essentially a legal document, all the way up to constructing light rail lines. We want people to feel heard, and we want people to feel like they have a sense of ownership over Project Connect, because that's really important. So I'd like to start, as Jackie said, just with a little bit of background on where we've come from, sort of the what is Project Connect and where are we headed. So looking at this timeline, you can see that starting in about 2018, we launched our community engagement and planning for Project Connect. And that was a very robust 2 years of community engagement, of technical planning, and of building towards 2020, when we realized there was going to be a choice that Austin residents needed to make. So in June of 2020, the Project Connect system plan and locally preferred alternatives, or LPAs, were adopted by the Capital Metro Board as well as the City of Austin. And for those of you who are looking for more information or for more visuals, I'll say this probably throughout, but you can go to projectconnect.com and very easily find that system plan, as well as some of these other documents that I'll mention here today. In July and August of last year, the initial investment and the finance and governance model for Project Connect was approved by the Capital Metro Board and City Council. And the election, Proposition A, to fund locally Project Connect was approved by City Council. And again, I think it's important to note, if you were to go onto projectconnect.com and look at the system plan, you'll notice that on a couple of spots along the map, there are dotted lines. For anything that is not a dotted line, that is the initial investment. That is what voters approved in November of 2020. And the dotted lines, those would be future investments that the community can decide to make later on, or when there's new funding sources available. So voters say yes in November of 2020 to Project Connect. In December of 2020, the Austin Transit Partnership, or ATP, Articles of Incorporation were filed, and a brand new organization, the ATP, Austin Transit Partnership, was created. And the role of the ATP, which I now work at, is to implement Project Connect. It's really to build Project Connect. And then now that we have moved into 2021, it's go time. So the ATP has an independent board that was appointed by the Capital Metro Board and City Council. It's made up of 5 individuals, one of them a representative, the mayor from City Council, one representative from the Capital Metro Board, as well as 3 community experts who each have a deep background and unique lived experiences in 3 different disciplines. Taking a look at the Project Connect program, so you can see here that initial investment and system map that I mentioned earlier, which is at projectconnect.com. You can see it here on the right. And then in the text to the left, you can see what we call the program components. So these are the lines that you see on the map, but they're broken out by the type of project that it is within the program. So the orange line, which will run from North Lamar Transit Center at North Lamar and 183, all the way down to Stastny and South Austin, Stastny and South Congress, would be a light rail investment, along with some extensions that would have Metro Rapid. And Metro Rapid, for those of you who haven't used Capital Metro service, that's a 15-minute or better high-quality bus line. And that's what would connect people from South Park Meadows up to Stastny, or from North Lamar Transit Center all the way up to Tech Ridge. The blue line is also a light rail corridor, and that runs from the airport down East Riverside before turning across the river over a bridge. And then it joins the orange line, and they run together from downtown up to North Lamar Transit Center. There is also going to be a downtown tunnel component. And I think that this is particularly exciting because Austin will have a subway. And there are so many benefits to that, some of them relating to customer comfort and others to future operations. But it's pretty exciting for Austin to be making an investment like this, not just in light rail, but in a subway downtown. Metro Rapid, again, that's the bus rapid transit line. We have a couple here on the map. They are in purple. And in fact, the Expo and Pleasant Valley lines, which run out towards the Expo Center in the Northeast and into downtown, and the Pleasant Valley line, which, like its name says, runs north-south along Pleasant Valley. These are already fairly far along in the design phase. And in fact, they are in the president's budget, because all of these projects we anticipate will receive a 40, 45, 50% or more share of federal dollars. The green line, that is a commuter rail line. So for anybody who's ridden on the existing red line, it would be similar to that, and it would run from downtown Austin to Plaza Saltillo, out through East Austin to Colony Park, and long-term to the cities of Manor. Improvements to the existing red line, as well as improvements to park and rides, Metro Express, and brand new transit centers within the city. We are also proposing as part of the program, and some of these have already come online, new neighborhood circulators, which you might have ridden or heard about, which Capital Metro calls pickup. These are on-demand, door-to-door services that are within a zone, and it's meant to connect people to transit, but it also might allow somebody to make a variety of trips within their zone. Also funding for a new maintenance facility so that we can maintain and house light rail vehicles and new electric buses for when they're not out on the road or the rails. New customer technology, so think of signs that show you when the next bus or train is coming, solar lighting, other customer amenities like that, as well as anti-displacement investments. Some of you may have heard of and may be interested in the $300 million that was within the larger multi-billion-dollar Project Connect program that has been tagged for investments to keep people in their homes or to create new developments that will allow for affordable housing along our transit corridors. And the goal is to make sure that the people who need these services the most will be able to live and thrive along these corridors. Looking at that same information, and I'll be quick here, but looking at that same information over time, you can line up the years at the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, as if they were the years in this decade. So 2021, 2022, and so on. You can see that the orange and the blue line, these are in what we call preliminary engineering, and we are getting closer to final design, which is a 2-year period, and they're undergoing what's called the Nepa process, and that means National Environmental Policy Act. And again, I mentioned that we expect a good portion of this investment to be funded through federal grants from the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is a really critical part of that process. And it's meant to make sure that we are assessing all of the impacts on the built and natural and human environment where we're doing these new investments. So that's what the gray bar is. But you can see again that new light rail is being built and planned and engineered together over the course of this decade. Improvements to the red line are ongoing right now. In fact, we just broke ground on another investment in North Austin between Lakeline and Leander, but there are also investments in new stations in Austin. And then the green line further in the future, Metro Rapid investments, which I mentioned are underway already. And then over time, new park and rides, Metro Express services, improvements to the existing bus service, which I think is always really critical to point out, is that Capital Metro is always investing in improvements in what we have today. And we want to make sure that that underlying bus network is able to interact well with the new light rail investments or bus rapid transit investments. But we want to make sure that over the course of this implementation, that we still have great, reliable local bus service, as well as Metro access for people with qualifying disabilities. Customer technology, and then you can see here the anti-displacement investments that I just mentioned are spaced out over the life of the project. So what is the Austin Transit Partnership? So as I mentioned, after the election, the City of Austin and Capital Metro, the boards of Capital Metro and City Council came together and decided to make a new independent local government corporation. That's what an LGC is. So this is a quasi-governmental entity, and the purpose of the Austin Transit Partnership, or ATP, is simply to construct much of, if not most of, the Project Connect investment. And here's how the work is divided up between the three partners. So the Austin Transit Partnership will work on the new orange and blue line light rail, as well as the tunnel downtown for those orange and blue line light rail lines. It will also work on the future Green Line commuter corridor out to Colony Park and eventually Manor, as well as the new maintenance facilities. Capital Metro will work on improvements to existing bus, Metro Rapid, Metro Express commuter bus services, as well as those neighborhood circulator pickup zones, customer technology, and improvements to our existing red line. Capital Metro will essentially continue to improve the services that it already does and does well. The City of Austin will play a critical role, not only in administering the transit supportive anti-displacement investments, the $300 million, but also assisting ATP and Capital Metro with all of the many things that we will need to build a light rail system outside of the tunnel in city streets. And so that would be utility relocations, permitting, right-of-way, things of that nature. So they are a critical partner in terms of implementation, but hopefully this gives you a sense of what the Austin Transit Partnership is here to do. So just real quick, just a couple of recent highlights. As I mentioned, we broke ground on a Lakeline to Leander red line improvement project that's meant to help increase the frequency and reliability of today's Metro rail service. On October 13th, so the 13th of this month, there will be a Meet the Team event at the new Project Connect program office at 203 Colorado, so on Colorado Street downtown between 2nd and 3rd Street. And this is going to be a new collaborative space for ATP, Capital Metro, City of Austin staff to come together, as well as for us to host more community events or ATP board meetings. And so I think everybody on staff is really excited to meet people in the community and welcome people to our new space. Also important to note, I'd mentioned the federal FTA, or Federal Transit Administration funding component. The orange and blue line, which are the light rail, were accepted into what's called project development. And this is a major milestone between getting the system planned and eventually getting that federal funding. So it starts a 2-year process of engineering and planning that ultimately will get us to a federal grant. So moving over to the Joint Powers Agreement, and I know that this is the focus of most of this evening's meeting. So some of you may have watched yesterday, there was a joint work session between the ATP board, the Capital Metro board, and City Council. And the purpose of that was not to take any action, but to just discuss this new document that's really a partnership agreement called the Joint Powers Agreement. I'm going to use the acronym JPA. And we try to limit the amount of acronyms that we use in transit, but we're sometimes very bad at that. So the JPA is the Joint Powers Agreement, and the three parties, Capital Metro, the city, and the ATP, will take action on this agreement on October 29th. So, components of what is going to happen on October 29th, and then I'll explain some of the agreements that have already happened, as well as what will be in this JPA itself. But in short, the idea behind the JPA is that it serves as the rules of the road for the three-party partnership as we are building this brand new transit system. And it is meant to allow us to move forward with certainty and to limit risk, but also to make sure that we have spent the time to talk to one another, to hear the concerns of council, the concerns of the two boards, and make sure that we listen to the community and incorporate in this document as much as we can to make the implementation go smoothly. But I'll also note that this document is not meant to be a solution for everything, and that we are always taking input, and that we always want to make sure that we are improving our processes and that we're as transparent as humanly possible. And there will be other agreements to come that we'll want the public's input on. But for October 29th, and for this JPA document, on October 29th, the ATP board is going to vote on a resolution that supports City of Austin staff in terms of the direction that they'll receive from City Council on implementation of Project Connect and what we're calling the Predictability Ordinance. And I'm going to let my colleague Leanne here in a bit describe what that is. Capital Metro's board will take a similar action, and the City of Austin will pass this Predictability Ordinance, which is really intended to help make for an efficient implementation process of Project Connect. And then the three parties will all come together and vote on the document that I'm going to describe here now. Looking at the timeline for this document. So the clock starts on election day. Voters approve Proposition A and the Project Connect investment. And since that time, we have formed and begun staffing and set up a brand new board for the ATP. And ATP, City of Austin, and Capital Metro staff have been drafting and negotiating and hearing ideas from one another about the best ways to implement this very complex, almost unprecedented, in fact, unprecedented investment in our community and in transportation. October 4th, yesterday, there was the work session that I mentioned. We have this evening's virtual public meeting, and then we are heading towards an October 29th approval of the JPA. Between that date, so November, and next year, there are going to be a number of other smaller actions that will be taken to assist with coordinating how we build new light rail and the tunnel and bus rapid transit and other investments between the city and Capital Metro, or maybe it's ATP and Capital Metro or ATP and the city. But this is probably one of the only agreements that will be between all three parties. In the lead up to the JPA, I think it's also important to remember that we have taken, we being Capital Metro and the City of Austin, taken a number of steps to make a better process for building this large investment. So in August of last year, there was an interlocal agreement, so that's like a partnership agreement, that committed to the creation of what is now the ATP. In December of 2020, after the election, Capital Metro and the City of Austin came together and they approved articles of incorporation, bylaws, and appointed the initial board for the ATP. That same month, Capital Metro and the City of Austin also created the Community Advisory Committee. And at the end of this presentation, there will be a slide that talks about some upcoming meetings, but there are a number of different advisory boards that the ATP has, or committees, that are called technical advisory committees. And then there's the Community Advisory Committee that really focuses on implementation of Project Connect, but also equity as well as those anti-displacement investments. So it's a really important group of folks, and I think it's important to call out that this was something that the Capital Metro Board and City of Austin City Council approved back in December. In January, Capital Metro and the ATP entered into an agreement so that they could help fund some of the initial staff. In March, there was an agreement between the ATP and City of Austin to help support the City of Austin's new Project Connect office, which my colleague Leanne, who will be on a little bit later, is a member of, as well as an interlocal agreement to transfer funding over for these anti-displacement investments. So a portion of that $300 million that I mentioned. And then finally in July, there was an interlocal agreement to establish procedures to transfer over the Proposition A property tax money from the city to the ATP, which was required by the contract with the voters. I'll mention what exactly the contract with the voters is here. But I think it's important as we look at this tri-party document that the structure of it is meant to speak to other documents that were approved by Capital Metro and the City of Austin, and also in effect approved by the voters of Austin, that were requirements for how do we want to build this enormous investment in mobility and do it the right way. So it set certain expectations for how we're going to build Project Connect. The contract with the voters, and you'll see a couple of specific examples from that here in just a moment, that was put together by City Council, and it was attached essentially to the call for the election. And it said, we're going to put this on the ballot, and if voters say yes, here's what we expect the city as well as the new Austin Transit Partnership to do so that we build this project in the right way, and we build it in the context of Austin and make sure that we are looking after its people. Capital Metro also approved a community commitment resolution that was very similar, and then there was an interlocal agreement between the City of Austin and Capital Metro that really created the ATP. So think of it as something of a foundational document for this new ATP. So looking at the JPA requirements, at the Joint Partnership Agreement requirements, you can see here up in the top right, we have a color code, and the first box is going to be things that were required for the JPA from the contract with the voters that City Council approved. Then you'll see a series of blue boxes that relate to requirements from the Capital Metro Board's Community Commitment Resolution from last year. And you can see here on the left or the middle column what the requirement is, and on the right, how that requirement is being honored, how it's being taken care of. So you can see that the contract with the voters required that tax revenue be transferred from the city to ATP, and that a procedure be established to sort out how those monies from Proposition A would be moved over to the ATP so that they could be spent on constructing and implementing Project Connect. And that was handled through a July 2021 interlocal agreement, or ILA. Items from the Capital Metro Community Commitment Resolution included dedicating the balance of Capital Metro's Capital Expansion Fund over to the ATP. Now, the Capital Expansion Fund was something of a savings account that Capital Metro had saved up over the years, and Capital Metro is funded through 1 penny of sales tax. And as Austin sales tax has grown, this was an opportunity to set some money aside so that we could quickly fund some of those early Project Connect projects. So think about some of the early planning work for light rail or Metro Rapid, et cetera. As well as in the Community Commitment Resolution, a requirement to transfer funds received from the federal government. So I did use an acronym here, so my apologies, but from the United States Department of Transportation, so USDOT, over to the ATP. So Capital Metro receives a federal grant. We will enter into an agreement so that ATP can receive that money and it can use it to help build the Project Connect system. Here in purple, and you can see this in the key up to the right, these are items that were required by both the contract with the voters as well as Capital Metro's community commitment resolution. One of them was a requirement that the Austin Transit Partnership participate in the Better Builder program or a similar program with worker protections for all construction workers, and that any contract that was issued for construction by the ATP included City of Austin hiring goals as allowed by federal law, completion of required safety training, workers' compensation, on-site monitoring that is independent from the construction companies. So that would be monitoring for safety as well as wages. And you can see here that this month, the Austin Transit Partnership Board will consider a resolution that will direct staff to include this kind of language in all of the contracts that go out from the ATP. So the ATP is about to build something and it's hiring a contractor, it has to include these kind of requirements in the contract language. The same is true for living wage or prevailing wage, as well as a requirement that there be paid sick leave and healthcare to the extent possible for workers on the project. This would also be in that October ATP board resolution. Capital Metro already incorporates these kind of requirements into its recent contracts, including those for Metro Rapid, which are some of the Project Connect investments that are happening early. Another one is that the Austin Transit Partnership takes steps to address potential impacts to businesses and residents during construction and develop a business impacts mitigation strategy that includes business outreach, resident outreach, communications, and making sure that during construction, we are supporting access and existing operations for our local and small businesses and creating effective project schedules that minimize the amount of impacts on residents as well as businesses here. And this will also be one of the October 20th ATP board actions. And now you can see here on the bottom part of this slide, a requirement that the ATP develop a comprehensive disadvantaged business enterprise program, or DBE, and maximize opportunities that are available to women, minority, and veteran-owned businesses, as well as small businesses, so that as we build this multi-billion-dollar program, we're creating opportunities for small, minority-owned, women-owned businesses to perhaps start as a subcontractor to one of the larger primes, or to be a prime themselves, but to build up small businesses, local businesses in Austin, so that over the life of this large program, over the course of the next decade, we're building Austin's local businesses. We're building the capacity of folks to work on projects of this scale, because this is really the first time that Austin has undertaken a project of this size. And so we're going to grow as a city. We're going to grow our transportation and our transit network, but we also want to grow communities and we want to grow small businesses. So the ATP board, to that end, adopted a disadvantaged business enterprise, or DBE, goal at our September meeting. The Capital Metro board is currently undergoing a study to see about the availability of local DBEs, as well as a disparity study, so that when we are looking to contract to build the program, we know where there are disparities and where there are areas that are not receiving as much business as others, for instance. And all of these goals and all of the metrics related to this will be brought back regularly to the ATP, as well as Capital Metro boards and the community, based on that study. Here in green, we've got items that were required from the August 2020 Capital Metro and City Council Interlocal Agreement that essentially created the ATP. One of them was a requirement that the ATP present a management report at an annual joint meeting. That's what's happening on October 29th, as well as to further delineate the roles and responsibilities of that community advisory committee that I mentioned. And that has already been accomplished. And the Community Advisory Committee, or CAC, is up and running and meeting regularly. That same August interlocal agreement that created the ATP also had the following requirements here. Some of them related to establishing corporate functions and governance, some related to financial policies, others related to making sure that money was moved to support the transit supportive anti-displacement investments. And you can see here on the right how those have already been accomplished. And I know that there's a lot of text here, but you can find these slides at atptx.org or projectconnect.com. So if you want to review it on your own time, and this is also being recorded if you want to rewatch this video. The JPA will also include mention of utility and right-of-way agreements. So this is really important. And when I was showing how we are breaking up the duties of the ATP, Capital Metro, the City of Austin, one of the really critical functions of the City of Austin was to help ATP and to help Capital Metro with movement of utilities. Under the ground, there are lots of communications, water, maybe electric lines. So how can we move them with minimal or no disruption and make sure that we're creating space for this new transit investment along with those utilities? And to that end, staff from the ATP and the City of Austin have been working on a new utility rules of practice so that we also have rules of the road, so to speak, for that very specific but very important part of this program. Design review and permitting standards. This will be one of the actions that's taken by the city on October 29th that my colleague Leanne will mention here in just a moment. DBE, which I've already mentioned, worker safety and wage requirements, which were also already mentioned and will be part of the ATP's October 20th board resolution and has already been incorporated into Capital Metro's Metro Rapid contracts and others that will come after that, and a robust community engagement process. So you all who are watching today and who may watch later are a part of that. And there's so much that goes into that, and there's so much that goes into building a project or a program of this scale. And it requires people like you, and it requires hearing you. It requires hearing the good and the bad and learning from our mistakes and learning from each other. And so the JPA language includes principles and commitments related to community engagement so that we're building this and doing right by the people of Austin, and that we're doing it in a way that gives people that sense of ownership over this program that voters approved and some people voted no on. But we want to make sure that as many people, if not everybody in this community, can feel that sense of ownership and hopefully that sense of pride in the program, both during construction and certainly when we're open for operations. And a couple of additional JPA highlights before I hand it over to my colleague, Leanne Conti from the City of Austin's Project Connect office. The Joint Powers Agreement is meant to formalize Capital Metro, the ATP, and the City of Austin's commitment to continued transparent and accountable community engagement and communications, and making sure that we seek out priority populations. So people of color, people who don't speak English as a first language, people who may be experiencing homelessness, a wide variety of people who, for lack of a better term, are not always heard, and to make sure that we hear them and that we consider and act on their input. We also will be establishing the financial model for the Project Connect program, the sequencing plan, which was the graphic that I showed you that showed how these projects work over a series of years, and how that could be updated and reviewed annually once we get to a really critical milestone called 30% design. And that's when we'll have the best sense yet of how the light rail investment looks in the street, where the stations are, things like that. And that will be in spring, summer of 2022. And the JPA also directs, as I mentioned, the creation and use of a utility rules of practice, which is currently in development by staff, including Leanne and her colleagues, as well as the ATP's technical staff, so that we can guide utility relocations and anything else that we need to move or replace in the street during the construction of light rail. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Leanne Conti from the City of Austin. And I believe after Leanne, we'll hand it back to Jackie briefly and then get into Q&A. Leanne?
Great, thank you, Sam. My name is Leanne Conti. I am the Chief of Staff at the city's Project Connect office. The Project Connect office was created in the city manager's office earlier this year to support the Austin Transit Partnership in the implementation of Project Connect. So we work very closely with Austin Transit Partnership and with Capital Metro. And I'm just going to cover a couple more items that are being considered on October 29th by the parties to these agreements. So in addition to the joint powers agreement itself, there is an item for city council consideration that is a resolution. The resolution directs the city manager and all of his staff to review city code criteria and processes to identify any kinds of impediments that we might have in our existing code to the delivery of Project Connect. Because the scale and the nature of the projects, as Sam mentioned, is so very different from projects that we've done in the past. So how can we permit these to move forward in adherence with the sequence timeframe that was approved by the voters last November? That would be our charge based on this resolution. Our current code is very focused to private development and not so much to those long capital improvement projects that we would see in the right-of-way like Project Connect. We want to consider what changes may be needed for this program of projects. The resolution also directs staff to bring back any code amendments necessary for Project Connect to City Council no later than April of 2022. In the intervening time, the direction to staff would be to interpret existing requirements in the code in a way that supports the implementation of Project Connect if there is any administrative authority in the interpretation of those requirements today. And Capital Metro and the ATP boards will also consider resolutions supporting the continued work with the city to identify any of those solutions to code or criteria that may be needed to be tailored for Project Connect. Could we go to the next slide, please? The other action item for City Council's consideration on October 29th is an ordinance. The intent of the ordinance is to provide the Austin Transit Partnership with predictability on the rules in place that they will use as they work on the design, working towards that critical 30% and even further towards 60% design that Sam talked about. The focus of this ordinance is for the orange and the blue lines. So those are the light rail lines, whose alignments are primarily within the city's right-of-way. The ordinance sets the permit application date of any permits that would be submitted for Project Connect to October 29th, 2020 of this year for any of those permits, and that would be submitted prior to the expiration date of the ordinance, which would be December 31st, 2022. So really that's a little more than a year that we would be setting the rules in stone so that they aren't changing while ATP is working towards 30% design. And during that time, we anticipate that we will have brought forward and have in place any of those adjustments to regulations that I just spoke about regarding the resolution that council would also be considering. So the resolution would bring those items forward in the time that we're kind of holding the rules steady. The ordinance also allows for the use of rules and regulations in place on October 29th or at the time of application. So this would allow agreement between the city manager and ATP if there were to be any changes to criteria or code requirements in that time frame that would be advantageous to Project Connect, that they would be able to go ahead and use those regulations. We wanted to make sure that this ordinance specifically called out the transportation criteria manual, which you may know is currently being updated and is in the rules posting process. So that's the city's administrative process to post criteria. And it's anticipated to go into effect this summer, June 2022. And the orange and blue line teams have already been working with our Austin Transportation Department to incorporate the updated street designs and other new criteria from the criteria manual into the 15% and 30% design. So we feel like those are already integrated into the work that's being done. And lastly, this ordinance would not apply to any regulation changes that would be made for the health and safety of our public per our Texas local government code or state code. And that the resolutions that Capital Metro and ATP would be considering on October 29th would also support the implementation of this ordinance. So the last slide that I have is just to summarize those action items that would be considered on October 29th. So as I mentioned, the resolutions for the ATP board and the Capital Metro board supporting the city staff direction resolution and the predictability ordinance. And then a city council would consider the ordinance, the predictability ordinance, and the resolution separately. And then there would be the tri-party action on the joint powers agreement that Sam reviewed with you. And with that, I think I will turn it back to Jackie to talk about looking ahead in this process, getting to October 29th.
Thanks, Leanne. So looking ahead for the rest of the month, there will be several opportunities for our community to weigh in on what we've learned about the joint partnership agreement or the joint powers agreement. October 5th, of course, is today. This is the virtual meeting. If people were not able to join us tonight, the video of this meeting will be posted on projectconnect.com. We are always taking comments on our website. You can also email us at feedback@capmetro.org. Then October 5th through the 28th, we'll be having our meetings with our technical advisory committees. So we have 3 of those technical advisory committees that work with our Austin Transit Partnership Board. We'll also be presenting to our Project Connect Community Advisory Committee and taking feedback from our advisory committee members. And we'll also be receiving feedback from a variety of stakeholders regarding our partnership agreements. On October 6th, one of our technical advisory committees tomorrow is meeting. That is the Engineering, Architecture, and Construction Advisory Committee. And we also have the Capital Metro Access Advisory Committee happening tomorrow evening, and they will receive a presentation and provide feedback as well. On October 7th, we have our Project Connect Community Advisory Committee, as well as the ATP, the Austin Transit Partnership Technical Advisory Committee, which is the Planning, Sustainability, Equity, and DBE Committee, also known as the PSEC. October 13th, we will be bringing this information and taking feedback from our Capital Metro Customer Satisfaction Advisory Committee. And all of this will be leading up to the tri-party meeting of the 2 boards and the City Council on October the 29th. We will also be presenting to our Project Connect Ambassador Network, which has a meeting on October the 12th. Excuse me, the 14th. If you have questions, if you have comments, we are always open to your feedback. Just email us, please, at feedback@capmetro.org, and we are happy to respond and submit your comments to our respective boards and city council members for consideration. And now we want to take your questions. So I'm going to take a look at our Q&A. Let's set my full screen so we can see. And the question is, when is the JPA or the joint partnership? Oh, I keep doing that. It's the joint powers agreement. My apologies. When is the joint powers agreement available to the public? And I'm assuming this means the final document. Sam, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So for people who would like to see the draft that was considered yesterday by City Council and the 2 boards, that is posted at ATP atptx.org, and you'll see a button there for board meetings, and you can access the draft language there. Jackie mentioned the feedback@capmetro.org email address. I would encourage folks to go to atptx.org and look at the draft. And if you want to send us your thoughts, please send them to feedback@capmetro.org. We will be incorporating comments over the course of the month, as well as comments that came from City Council and the board members before we post for the October 29th board meeting, I believe on October 22nd. Now, we take comments all the time. We do try to post these materials that are going to be voted on 1 week ahead of time. And we will continue to take comments, but I would encourage people to take a look starting today and provide us your comments, if possible, by October 22nd. And again, that will be posted at atptx.org, as well as the City of Austin's City Council agenda website and the Capital Metro board site, because all three bodies will be meeting.
All right, let's see, we've got a couple here. Does year one on our timeline stand for 2021 and year two, 2022?
Good question. Yes, it does. And very quickly, just for the benefit of everybody watching, I can pull it back up just in case anyone didn't see that. But yes, when you look here, there we go. When you look here, you can see the years up at the top. They do correspond with 2021, 2022, 2023, and so forth. So conveniently, those two things matched up because voters said yes in November of 2020. Good question.
All right, we have a question here. In December of 17th of 2018, Capital Metro's Project Connect long-term vision plan excluded North Lamar Transit Center, where rail is 24 to 30 years. This is referring to a slide that was used in our presentation for the joint meeting. Why do slides now say Project Connect begins and ends at North Lamar Transit Center? What is TxDOT's role with the Orange Line extension from North Lamar Transit Center to Tech Ridge and public participation? Thanks.
So I can, Jackie, if you wanted to speak to any of the public participation component of it, but I can just say when the what was called the vision plan, which you're referring to from 2018, was approved, it included the entirety of the map. Probably be helpful to also pull that up again. It included the entirety of this map that you can see here on the right. From 2018 on, as we headed towards June of 2020, staff looked at, with an eye towards competitiveness for federal grants, which is going to be a really critical part of getting this done, especially if it does wind up being 50% or more, or maybe a little bit less of the total cost. And as we were looking at the lines with that in mind, the extensions on the Orange Line didn't rate quite as high. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And it has nothing to do with the importance of those communities or the needs from a transit perspective of those communities. There's just certain metrics that go into how those ratings come together. Your mention of TxDOT is also right on. TxDOT is one of our partners in all of this. And they do own the right-of-way actually between just south of North Lamar Transit Center at Morrow, all the way up to the end of Lamar, which then eventually turns over 35 and gets to Tech Ridge. Same goes for South Congress, south of Stastny, all the way down to Slaughter, where we have the proposed Slaughter Transit Center near South Park Meadows. We're continuing to coordinate with them, and we would need to enter into a separate agreement, and that would likely be between ATP and TxDOT, although it could be between Capital Metro and TxDOT, so that when funding comes available, could be a later election, could be grant funding that we don't yet have or may not even exist yet, so that we could fund those extensions of the Orange Line. We will need to enter into an agreement with TxDOT so that we can bridge that small gap between Morrow and North Lamar up to the North Lamar Transit Center itself. And again, just a reminder for other folks on the meeting tonight, is that outside of the tunnel, these lines run generally in the middle of the street. And so that's one of the most critical reasons why we are coordinating with the City of Austin, but as this participant mentioned, is also why we need to come into an agreement with TxDOT so that we can extend up that little gap to North Lamar Transit Center and later get all the way up to Tech Ridge. Before funding comes together for those extensions on the Orange Line, both south of Stastny, north of North Lamar Transit Center, those segments, after light rail is operational, will have Metro Rapid bus service between the northernmost and southernmost light rail stations up to Tech Ridge and down to Slaughter Transit Center at South Park Meadows, because we want to ensure that there is 5 to 10 minute bus service that easily connects people into the light rail, even if the light rail has not yet been built further south. So I would say TxDOT is ultimately going to be one of our biggest partners as we build out the entire program, but they are a really critical partner on the initial investment, just like the City of Austin is and many other stakeholders here. Jackie, anything I missed on engagement, either in the lead up to 2018 or in the lead up to the selection of the initial investment?
Just will mention that in the lead up to 2018, we did engage with neighborhoods along this portion of the Orange Line corridor. And when we begin to design stations for the service that will be, the bus service that will be serving in the interim until we develop light rail over there, we will be doing outreach opportunities to talk about station design and access and amenities. So we'll be back out to the community at that time to talk about that, to make sure that that service does serve the community and the neighborhoods around it the way it should. We have a question here that says, the engineering documents for the Orange Line show that the red line being sunken at Crestview Station beneath North Lamar and Airport Boulevard, with the freight line staying at grade. What does this fit into, where does this fit into the timeline of the project?
You're on mute if you're talking.
Yes, my apologies. I would say that's a very good question. So you had seen the timeline slide. Oops. Here we go. For both the Orange Line as well as the Red Line, you can see that our current Red Line improvements, which are mainly double tracking so that we have more places for the trains to pass one another and we can increase frequency and reliability of that service, that's really what's shown in these years 1, 2, and 3, or today through 2023, let's say. As part of the construction of the Orange Line, if we were to bury or change the elevation of today's Red Line, which for folks who don't know, Capital Metro not only has the Red Line commuter rail on the 32 miles that goes from downtown Austin up to the Capital Metro member city of Leander, we also run freight over that. And obviously folks who live near that line probably have seen or heard some of those trains, but we run freight overnight because we have a common carrier obligation, they call it, to keep doing so. And it also generates money that's invested back into commuter rail. But one of the proposals, as this participant pointed out, would be to have the Orange Line here cross over the Red Line, running at the same level as the street is today, and that the Red Line, which would also mean the freight line, would go below ground. And you can think of it as sort of an open cut, they call it, or something of a concrete walled trench. But this is just one of the design options as we're trying to work through a very complex intersection. For those of you who have been up to Crestview, you know that not only does the very busy north and south North Lamar come together with Airport Boulevard, as well as the existing Red Line, overnight freight, and then now we're going to have a future Orange Line. And so we're at this point called 15% design, which is what was in the documents that this participant is referencing. And that showed a couple of design options. And one of the ones that rose up towards the top, but is still not set in stone, is to separate the Orange Line from the Red Line. As we move towards what's called 30% design in the spring and summer of next year, we'll continue to have our engineers and other stakeholders, including community stakeholders, weigh in on that idea, because there are other options to make that intersection work for the Red Line, for freight, for people in cars, for bus customers, and for the Orange Line, but we just need to study them more. And it could be that the Orange Line goes above and the Red Line and freight stays as is. There's a finite number of options, but there are options out there. But what was referenced in the question is one of them, which would be light rail stays at the same level as the street today, and the Red Line goes beneath it and then would come back up a little bit further north and south.
And Sam, I think that segues perfectly into a question we received that says, if we're looking to get more involved in the public transportation and urban planning community, what events or resources are important to attend and participate in other than this and the Meet the Team on October 13th? And wanted to mention, Crestview brings up a good point. You know, we have parts of the light rail corridors that pose some significant design challenges, and we're going to be going out to our community to talk to people who live and work and interact in those areas to help us find some solutions that make sense for those areas. And Crestview will be one of them. So keep your eye on the projectconnect.com website for opportunities to participate in these working group discussions. We actually have one coming up next week on the 12th. That one is for the Blue Line Bridge, which will be crossing over Lady Bird Lake. We encourage you to register for that and participate. It's our opportunity to work with people at the neighborhood level and make sure that this design is serving the people who live and work and will use it.
And I'll also note real quick, Jackie, just on one quick follow-up on Crestview, and I was trying to describe it correctly this way when I was showing the timeline, and you saw the Red Line investments as well as the Orange Line, and the fact that this participant was talking about how they cross over one another, is that lowering the Red Line would be a separate project from the Orange Line. So just to make that clear, and that we would also need to identify new funding sources to do so. That is not part of the current Project Connect budget, but we know that there are a lot of funding sources that are out there. They're extremely competitive, but I think that we're building the right team so that we can get the funding in place to build not only the system that was put out there to voters, but other improvements along the way. So, Jackie?
We've got one here about our neighborhood circulators, and the question is, will names and geographical areas of the neighborhood circulators be announced sometime soon? And we did launch 3 new circulator services as part of the Project Connect program this summer. We launched one in the Dessau area, in Menchaca, and most recently in Oak Hill. There will be others. I don't know, Sam, if you know any information on timeline for any others that are coming, but we do not have a list of those specifically in the order that they will happen, right?
No, that's a good point, Jackie. I will go back and work with the Capital Metro team, who are the folks that operate these services. I know that we launched a flurry of new zones over the past fiscal year, and our current fiscal year started October 1, and I would have to go back online or into one of the Capital Metro budget documents to see how many more are in store for this coming October 1 to September 30th? That's a very good question. But those zones in particular are really great because they're designed to work the best for that community. They're a transit service that is truly in the context of that community. And there's so many ways for people to weigh in to let our Capital Metro service planners know, where do people want to go? What do they need? What times of day work best? And even what could the name of the zone be? So that when people hear it, they know it's theirs. And again, you get that sense of pride and makes it easier to do your trip planning. I think our talented producer has pulled up a map of where those zones are, and you can see them here in purple. And this should be at capmetro.org, and you can see a small image of a little van that's blue that says pickup. But here you can see where those zones are. I believe, and Jackie or Lonnie Stern could correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that we're up to 11 or 12 zones within the service area, as well as one in partnership with the city of Pflugerville, which pays on a contract basis for service so that we can tie in Pflugerville residents to not only to great locations within the city of Pflugerville, but also to the Tech Ridge Park. Good question.
All right, we have a question. How does Project Connect benefit minorities excluded from the initial investment north of US 183? Farmer Lane taxpayers, an example, Harris Branch, Samsung to Apple East-West, and Blacks waiting 60 minutes on new routes, about 10 times longer than the Metro Rail, Crestview, White Choice Riders, and Southeast Dove Springs Hispanics.
Well, I know that I've worked very closely with Jackie over the years, as well as our community engagement team and service planning, to try to address discrepancies that are out there, or areas that have historically not had enough investment, not just in transit or transportation infrastructure, but other services that people expect from their government. As I mentioned, for those extensions on the orange line, and I would say that the same could be said of the green line, and one reason why it's a little bit further along in the timeline is just how they rate under the current rating structure with the federal government. And they're oftentimes geared towards where there's anticipated ridership, but we all know that that's not the whole story. Transit is designed to be a tool for equity and affordability and sustainability. And so while the lines that are along Parmer and the light rail lines that are north of Lamar Transit Center may be part of a later future investment, today, I would say that Capital Metro is proud of the investments that we have made to date in the Northeast, but we also know that there's always room for improvement. And we want to hear from customers like this participant, it sounds like, or their communities, and figure out how can we better move people? How can we move people more efficiently, more effectively, and more equitably? So I think it's a very valid point. I would say right now, considering that the initial investment map is what was approved by voters in November of 2020, there is always work to be done to get more support for further investment and in Project Connect, but also to work with our partners at Capital Metro so that our bus service works the best for the most number of people. That's a good comment, good question.
And yes, it is a good comment. And I want to mention also that all of your questions and comments that we're receiving tonight will be part of the feedback that we're going to provide to the leadership of both the City of Austin and Capital Metro, as well as the Austin Transit Partnership Board, will be part of the record of feedback that will be considered by those bodies. So thank you. We have a question. After the vote on the JPA, which is the Joint Powers Agreement, I'll say it correctly this time, on the 29th, what subject areas can we expect to be covered in future interlocal agreements? In particular, are there specific items we will be addressing sooner rather than later?
That's a very good question. I would say that the Joint Powers Agreement attempts to make sure that we've covered everything that was included in the contract with the voters, in the Capital Metro Community Commitment, and the interlocal agreement between the City of Austin and Capital Metro that created the Austin Transit Partnership. I think that it, first and foremost, was meant to lock in those promises to the community, either in the JPA or showing how they've already been accomplished previously or how we're going to handle them separately, like the 3 items that are going to be considered by the ATP board on October 20th. So better builder program or similar, worker protections, DBE, those kinds of things. I would say beyond what you've heard about today, a couple of things that we mentioned would be refining the utility rules of practice. The City of Austin continues to work on an equity tool as well as other mechanisms for administering the anti-displacement funding, so the $300 million that I mentioned earlier that you might have heard of before. And then as we move further into design and ultimately construction, I think there'll be a lot of agreements on a wide variety of topics that I probably wouldn't want to guess at right now, but I can imagine that some of the buckets will relate to things like community engagement. We mentioned that one of the items in the contract with the voters is having not only robust community engagement, but also having a construction mitigation program for residents and businesses. That's something that's going to need to be refined over time and may be supported or governed in part by agreements between the ATP and the city, or ATP and Capital Metro. I don't know if my colleagues, Jackie or Leanne, can think of any other items, but I think that what was covered this evening is not exhaustive, but it's a lot of what's on our radar, and it's a lot of what's been required of us by voters, by city council, and by the 2 boards. But this will be an ongoing, iterative, learn as we go process. And whenever we do have additional interlocal agreements or other agreements that the parties need to come up with, we will certainly be back out to community members to explain it as best we can and get people's input.
Sam, if I could just add, I think you're completely correct that, we only know what we know right now that's needed, and we know what the requirements were that voters approved and our policy making bodies approved last year, and we've attempted to address all of those with the draft joint powers agreement that was published. And I think some things that I can think of easily that are future agreements would be things like operations and maintenance, the actual operation of the light rail in the city's right-of-way, and how that will interface with any sort of maintenance that the city is doing in the right-of-way, or that private utilities would be doing in the right-of-way. Things like safety, how will we respond to different emergencies surrounding the interface of the light rail and light rail stations and our roadways and other elements of our public realm. So those are some, I think, future agreements that will definitely be needed. Another possible more like near term would be just real estate acquisitions, how that will work, as we need to make sure that the Austin Transit Partnership has the appropriate rights to different property to make sure that the train can operate in those spaces. Obviously, the city's right-of-way is a place that we're working very closely. But as we cross the lake, we have parkland and other types of spaces, and so I think that's another example where we would have a separate agreement, and those agreements might just be between the city and Capital Metro, or between Capital Metro and the Austin Transit Partnership. The JPA is very focused on those things that are a tri-party item.
We had a question that was previously answered in the Q&A, but I want to bring it up because we have some additional information to share. The question was, have final design services been awarded for engineering or only for the NEPA and preliminary phase? If not, when is that anticipated, and is there an anticipated DBE goal for design? And we received an update from John Roan, who is who heads up our construction and design team at the ATP. And John says that design services have been awarded for the Nepa preliminary engineering phase only. The anticipated award for general engineering consultant services to advance to final design is spring of 2022. And currently we do not yet have a DBE goal. Thank you, John, for answering that question. Let's see. We have, let's see. I think that might be all. We have a couple of great comments, I will say. Wanted to thank you all for this ambitious project. I've kept up with it since I found out about it in early 2020, and it reignited my lifelong love of trains and rail travel. And I'm now starting to work on my degree in civil engineering to hopefully work on projects like this in the future. Thanks, y'all. That is great. Thank you, Eric, for that comment. It's nice to get a positive comment like that. We appreciate it. And I think that, I am missing 2 open questions. Let's see. I don't see them here unless, here we go. I see them. Okay. Will Project Connect allow for new local routes in the near future?
I wouldn't say that new local routes, other than the BRT investments, the first 2 of which, so the new Metro Rapid lines on Pleasant Valley, which we expect to break ground on at the end of this year, I believe, as well as the Expo line that heads from downtown northeast and eventually to the Expo Center. Those would be the newest bus improvements, but Capital Metro undergoes service changes 3 times a year in January, June, and August. And you probably remember the bus network redesign from June of 2018 that was pretty extensive. I don't know if we'll do any kind of redesign of the bus network or addition of new routes that's that extensive before light rail starts, but we will be working on a plan so that when light rail does start, the local bus services, the express bus services, the high frequency routes all work in tandem with light rail. Between now and then, though, again, since there are the 3 time a year service changes, I would say as new needs arise, our service planning team at Capital Metro will always look for new opportunities to expand service or recalibrate service wherever we need to. But I don't know specifically of any changes or additions to the local bus network for the coming year. It's a good question.
Okay, we have one about the blue line here. Current designs have a large section of the blue line being elevated around the airport after crossing 183. What is the reasoning for elevated versus tunneling under the runway or running at grade along the same route?
Since we have John Roan on, I'm wondering if he might be able to put an answer into the chat, but
I think we have one. I'm going to read it from the chat.
Okay.
The current design for the blue line after crossing 183 is elevated in coordination with TxDOT and the airport, Austin Bergson International Airport, Cities Airport. Tunneling will not allow for the transition from the main line tracks to the rail yard. That answers the question.
I knew there was a good technical answer for that, but that's a very good, savvy question.
Okay, here's one regarding public involvement and transparency. Will you include public comments collected through robust community engagement in the Joint Powers Agreement meeting backup material on October 29th, like the Capital Metro Planning Organizations packets? The answer is yes. We will be compiling a report of all feedback received, including at this meeting. That will be part of that backup packet for the October 29th meeting. I don't know if Leanne or Sam want to add anything to that.
No, that's the plan. And we want to make sure that people not only can see the draft of the joint partnership agreement, joint powers agreement, but also see what comments were made and how they might have been incorporated into the final document.
All right, I think that is all of our questions. Thanks everybody for your participation and for being so engaged. We appreciate the opportunity and encourage you to send us more feedback. If you think of other questions, other concerns, email us at feedback@capmetro.org. They will become part of the record that will be considered by all three bodies, and they will be available in the packet for the October 29th meeting. We want to thank you for your time. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, everybody who helped us moderate. Thanks, Lonnie, for your technical direction on this, as always. And thank you to John Roan, who helped us with the technical questions. Please, we encourage you to participate in our next community design workshop on October the 12th for the Blue Line Bridge. Should be a lot of fun. So we hope to see you there, and thanks again for your time. Good night, everyone.